Imagine waking up and the person you love most in the world, the woman who raised you, who made your childhood feel safe, who you just sat with at a dinner table playing cards only hours before, is simply gone. No note, no sign of struggle visible to the naked eye. No explanation that makes any sense at all. Just a door that should have been locked, and a neighborhood that had gone quiet, and a security camera that someone had reached up and silenced with their own two hands in the middle of the night. Now imagine that you are one of the most recognizable faces in American television. You greet millions of people every single morning from a screen in their kitchen. You have spent your entire adult career asking the hard questions on behalf of the public. And now, the hardest question of your life is the one you cannot answer yourself. Where's my mother? That is where this story begins. Not in a police briefing room. Not in a federal evidence lab. Not in the cold blue light of a surveillance monitor. It begins at a dinner table in Tucson, Arizona, on an ordinary evening, with an 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie surrounded by the people she loved. And it ends, if it ends, somewhere that investigators are still fighting to reach. You're watching Cold Case 007, and I promise you this, by the time this is over, you will never look at a security camera the same way again. Here is the thing about this case that most people do not fully absorb when they first hear about it. The moment that changed everything. The single detail that turned this from mysterious disappearance into something far more calculated and far more personal was not found by a forensic team. It was not uncovered by a DNA lab or a blockchain analyst or a behavioral psychologist with 20 years of criminal profiling behind them. It was found in 44 seconds of footage from a Nest security camera mounted on a front porch in a quiet residential neighborhood in the Sonoran Desert. 44 seconds. That is shorter than most television commercials. That is shorter than it takes most people to brush their teeth. And inside those 44 seconds, there is a single gesture so small, so unhurried, so almost unremarkable that the first time most people watch the footage, they almost miss it entirely. A figure in a ski mask walks up to the camera, reaches out two fingers, and taps the lens. Not frantically, not urgently, not with the jittery, adrenaline-soaked movements of someone doing something they have never done before in a place they have never been before. Slowly, deliberately, with the casual, muscle memory ease of someone touching a surface they have touched 1,000 times. That tap, those two fingers, that single quiet gesture in the dark at 1:47 in the morning. That is the detail that investigators, behavioral analysts, forensic psychologists, and millions of people watching from their living rooms could not let go of. Because that tap told a story. And the story it told was not about a stranger who had stumbled into the wrong yard. The story it told was about someone who already knew exactly where that camera was, exactly how it was mounted, exactly how close they needed to get to cover the lens. Someone who had stood in that spot before. Someone for whom the space at the top of those porch steps was not unfamiliar territory at all. Someone who moved through it the way you move through your own home in the dark. Without thinking, without hesitating, without being afraid. And that is what makes this case different from so many others that have filled the headlines in recent years. This is not a case about a stranger who targeted a vulnerable person at random. This is not a case where the motive is mysterious, or the geography is complicated, or the suspect pool spans an entire city of strangers. The behavioral evidence in this case, from the very first seconds of footage, points towards someone close. Someone known. Someone who had a seat at the dinner table. And that is what makes it not just chilling, but devastating. Now, before we go any further, before we get into the footage and the forensics and the FBI and the Bitcoin wallet and the brown paper bag and the glove on the side of the road, I need you to know who Nancy Guthrie is. Not as a case, not as a headline, not as the mother of a famous woman, as a person. Because cases like this one have a way of reducing the human being at the center of them to a series of data points and surveillance stills and criminal theory, and Nancy Guthrie deserves infinitely better than that. Nancy is 84 years old, She's a mother and a grandmother and a woman who, by every single account from every single person who knows and loves her, has moved through her life with a kind of quiet, grounded dignity that you only ever recognize in someone who has genuinely and completely earned it. She's the kind of woman who shows up, who remembers, who sits at the card table and laughs, and makes the room feel warmer just by being in it. She is not someone who courts attention or drama or the spotlight. She is someone who built a life in the steady, unhurried way that real lives get built. One ordinary evening at a time, one family dinner at a time, one good night and I love you at a time. She has spent years in Tucson, Arizona. It is a city she chose, a city she knows, a neighborhood she belongs to. The kind of neighborhood where the mailman knows your name and the people next door wave when they see you pull into the driveway, and the silence after midnight is not unsettling. It is just the sound of a place where people feel safe. That is where Nancy lived. That is where she was supposed to be safe. And she is the mother of Savannah Guthrie. For anyone who does not immediately recognize that name, Savannah Guthrie is one of the co-anchors of the Today show on NBC. She has been one of the most visible faces in American morning television for years. She has sat across from presidents and senators and world leaders. She has covered breaking news from some of the most consequential moments in recent American history. She is someone who has spent her entire professional life bearing witness to other people's hardest moments and asking the questions that the public needed answered. And now she's on the other side of it. Now she's the one standing in front of cameras with red eyes and a breaking voice and a desperation in her face that no amount of professional composure can fully contain, begging the world to help find her mother. That detail, the fact that Nancy Guthrie is Savannah Guthrie's mother, matters to this investigation in ways that extend far beyond the media coverage it has generated. It matters forensically. It matters as a question of motive. It matters as a lens through which certain behavioral elements of this crime start to look very different once you put them through it. We will return to this. But first, the night itself. The evening of Nancy's disappearance had been, by every account, ordinary in the best possible way. The family had gathered. There was dinner. There were card games. There was the particular, irreplaceable warmth of a household full of people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. It was the kind of evening that you do not think to photograph or document, because it does not feel like an occasion. It feels like just another Tuesday, just another dinner, just another night where you hug someone goodbye without any awareness whatsoever that the hug might need to mean more than it usually does. Present that evening was Tommaso San, 50 years old, the husband of Annie Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and Savannah's sister. By every outward account, Tommaso San was a man completely embedded in the fabric of his family. He had 15 years in the classroom as a science teacher. He played bass in a local independent band. He was a father. He was someone who showed up at family dinners and drove his mother-in-law home and said goodnight at the door and occupied, visibly and apparently comfortably, the kind of steady, established, unremarkable place inside a family structure that most people spend their whole lives working toward. At 9:50 in the evening, Tommaso drove Nancy home. He walked her in. He said goodnight. He left. The neighborhood went quiet. The street went dark. And the world kept moving as it always does, completely indifferent to the fact that somewhere inside those ordinary minutes, something was being said in a motion that would shatter the quiet of that street permanently. 3 hours and 57 minutes after Tommaso, San walked Nancy Guthrie through her front door and said goodnight. The Nest security camera mounted on Nancy's front porch was manually disconnected. At 1:47 in the morning, in the dark, by a figure in a ski mask who walked up those porch steps without hesitation, reached the camera in a direct line without scanning the space, and tapped the lens with 2 fingers before covering it with a branch. 44 seconds from a moment that figure entered the camera's field of view to the moment the feed went dark. 44 seconds. And in those 44 seconds, as we are about to discover, the person who thought they were erasing the evidence had already made the most consequential mistake of their entire plan. Here is what most people do not understand about modern cloud-based home security systems and why it matters so profoundly to this particular case. The architecture of these systems, the fundamental technical design that underlies every Nest camera, every Ring doorbell, every cloud-connected security device of this generation, is built around a single core principle. The footage does not live on the device. It lives in the cloud, and the upload does not happen after the recording is finished. It does not wait for the camera to complete a clip or save a file. The moment a motion sensor is triggered, the system begins transmitting data, frame by frame, in real time, to a remote server located somewhere that is physically and entirely disconnected from the camera itself. What this means in practice is elegant, and for anyone attempting to destroy that footage by disabling the camera, deeply frustrating. By the time a person reaches up and covers the lens, or disconnects the power, or physically removes the device from the wall, the frames that were captured in the moments before that action are already gone, already uploaded, already sitting safely in a digital archive that is beyond the reach of anyone who does not have the account credentials and the legal authority to access it. The footage had already left the building. The data was already safe. The cloud had already swallowed it whole. So when the FBI reviewed that footage, when they sat down with what the camera had captured in those 44 seconds before the feed went dark, they were not working from a lucky backup or a partial recovery. They were working from a complete, high-resolution, infrared-enhanced record of every single frame of what happened on that porch at 1:47 in the morning. Every step, every gesture, every behavioral detail, all of it intact, all of it preserved, all of it waiting to be taken apart. And the FBI did not keep what they found quietly to themselves. They pushed that footage into public circulation deliberately and strategically. They understood that what those 44 seconds contained was not simply a visual record of crime in progress. It was a behavioral fingerprint, a profile, a set of physical and psychological characteristics that, when examined with the right forensic tools and the right analytical framework, could be just as identifying as a thumbprint on a glass. And behavioral fingerprints, unlike physical ones, are not always legible to the untrained eye in real time. But under the kind of forensic analysis that the FBI's behavioral science resources can bring to bear, they're often the thing that breaks a case wide open. So let us go through the footage, frame by frame, detail by detail, because every single element of what those 44 seconds show has something to tell us. The figure enters the frame from the left. The gait is even. The pace is unhurried. There is no acceleration, no urgency in the movement that would suggest a person operating under elevated stress or fear. The shoulders are relaxed. The head does not swivel. The eyes, or rather the area around the eyes visible through the mask, do not scan the space. There is no checking the street behind, no glancing at the neighboring windows, no pausing at the base of the steps to assess the situation before committing to the approach. The figure simply walks toward the camera the way you walk toward your own front door, directly, without deliberation, as if the path from the sidewalk to the porch is already known. That absence of scanning behavior is, to a trained forensic behavioral analyst, one of the most significant things in the entire clip. When human beings enter unfamiliar high-stakes environments where they are afraid, where they're doing something they have never done before, where the consequences of being seen or caught are catastrophic, the nervous system generates a predictable and well-documented set of physiological responses. The threat detection system activates. The eyes begin to move more rapidly, covering a wider visual field. The head turns. The breathing changes. The stride shortens slightly as the body prepares for sudden movement. The shoulders tighten. The hands may show micro-tremors. These are not conscious decisions. They are hardwired biological responses that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years specifically to help human beings navigate dangerous, unfamiliar territory. None of those responses are visible in this figure. Not one. The nervous system is quiet. The body is at ease. And that ease, That total absence of the physiological markers of stress in a person who is committing a violent federal crime in the middle of the night on a residential street is not nothing. It is, in the language of behavioral forensics, a data point of the highest order. It tells the analyst something very specific. This person is not in unfamiliar territory. This person's nervous system does not register this space as dangerous or new or uncertain. This person is at some deep, pre-conscious biological level completely at home here. And then there is the tap. He reaches the camera directly, without searching for it, without looking for it the way you look for something you have not seen before, and he extends 2 fingers and he taps the lens. Slowly, with what analysts describe as deliberate, light, rhythmic pressure. And then he holds his hand there for just a moment. Not gripping, not smashing, just resting. The way you rest your hand on a familiar surface. The way you touch a wall you have walked past 1,000 times. Forensic behavioral analysts have a name for this specific type of gesture. They call it an ownership tap. And the reason they give it that name is because of what it communicates about the relationship between the person doing the tapping and the object being tapped. An ownership tap is not a functional gesture. It is not designed to accomplish anything. It is not the gesture of someone trying to break the camera or move the camera or examine the camera. It is the gesture of someone expressing, through unconscious muscle memory, a possessive familiarity with the object they are touching. It is the physical language of belonging, of ownership, of a claim that does not need to be spoken because the body is already saying it. Think for a moment about the objects in your own life that you touch in that way. The steering wheel of your car that your hands wrap around before your brain has consciously decided to grip it. The coffee mug on your desk that your fingers find without your eyes needing to direct them. The light switch at the top of your staircase that your hand reaches for in the dark without any awareness that you are reaching at all. These are not random behaviors. They are the accumulated result of repetition, of familiarity, of having been in the same place, performing the same action enough times that the behavior has migrated out of the conscious mind entirely and embedded itself in the body's automatic operating system. For the 2-finger tap on that camera lens to be the kind of gesture, and the behavioral analysts who reviewed the footage were consistent and specific in their assessment that it was exactly that kind of gesture, the person who made it would have had to have touched that camera or stood at that precise point on those porch steps enough times for the motion to become automatic. For the body to know where the camera was before the conscious mind needed to confirm it. For the reach to happen without the look that would have preceded it if the camera were unfamiliar. That is the behavioral argument, and it is, by the assessment of every expert who reviewed this footage, one of the strongest behavioral arguments in the entire case. Now let's talk about what they were wearing. Because the outfit this figure assembled for this crime is a study in contradictions that has generated more analysis and more debate than almost any other element of the case. And not all of that debate leads where you might expect it to. Starting from the top, the ski mask is a basic synthetic model. The kind you can find folded in a bin near the checkout counter at any sporting goods store in Tucson. No tactical features. No special ventilation design. No performance materials. The kind of mask that costs approximately $22 and is designed for recreational winter sports by someone who lives somewhere it actually snows. It is as generic as a piece of clothing can be. The holster is a belly band. For anyone unfamiliar with the term, a belly band holster is a wide strip of elastic fabric designed to be worn flat against the skin directly underneath a shirt or jacket, holding a firearm pressed tightly against the body in a completely concealed position. It is a legitimate and widely used concealed carry method. When worn correctly, it is invisible, it is secure. It does what it is designed to do. This man was not wearing it correctly. He was wearing it on the outside of a thick jacket, loose against the fabric, shifting visibly as he moved, in a configuration that anyone with even a single afternoon of firearms training would immediately recognize as wrong. A former federal agent who reviewed the footage described it in terms that were direct and unambiguous. No one with one day of tactical experience would carry a weapon that way. The backpack is an Ozark brand model, budget, functional, and fitted on both shoulder straps with bright reflective safety strips. The kind of strips that are standard on gear designed for pedestrians and cyclists who need to be seen in low-light conditions. The kind of strips whose entire purpose is to catch whatever light is available and amplify it, to make the person wearing them visible. On a man conducting a covert operation in a residential neighborhood in the middle of the night, these strips would glow under every passing car's headlights, every active porch light, every functioning street lamp within line of sight. The gloves are black nitro gloves, not tactical gloves, not law enforcement gloves, not anything from a security or military supply catalog. Nitro gloves are the kind used in workshops, kitchens, auto garages, plumbing jobs, any context where a person needs to handle chemicals or biological materials and does not want to contaminate either their hands or their work. A box of 100 of them costs approximately $10. They're disposable. They're completely ordinary in any professional maintenance or laboratory setting. Total cost of the entire outfit: mask, holster, backpack, gloves, approximately $100. Now, here is where this gets interesting, because there are two fundamentally different ways to interpret what you are looking at when you catalog this outfit, and they lead to completely opposite conclusions about who this person is and what kind of threat they represent. The first interpretation is the straightforward one, and it is the one that many investigators reached initially. This is not a professional. This is not someone with training or experience or a criminal record that spans carefully executed operations. This is someone impulsive, someone underprepared, someone who went to a sporting goods store and hardware store and assembled the cheapest version of a disguise they could imagine in a limited amount of time, driven by desperation rather than planning. The holster worn wrong, the reflective strips on the backpack, the generic ski mask. All of it points towards someone operating on urgency and panic rather than expertise and preparation. Someone who watched enough crime dramas to know they needed a disguise, but not enough real criminal operational experience to know what an effective disguise actually looks like. That interpretation leads to a profile that points in one direction. The second interpretation is considerably more disturbing, and it is the one that a group of forensic psychologists and behavioral analysts, people who have spent careers studying how intelligent, educated criminals construct their crimes, raised when they reviewed the same footage. What if the clumsiness is not accidental? What if every single mismatched, amateur, conspicuously wrong detail of this outfit was deliberately chosen, not out of ignorance, but out of a sophisticated understanding of how investigators build behavioral profiles and what conclusions those profiles lead to? What if the person who assembled this $100 disguise understood that a crime scene this messy, this low budget, this apparently improvised would generate a profile pointing away, far away from someone educated, someone professional, someone with a stable social position and a community reputation and no criminal history? What if the incompetence is itself the costume? What if the figure who walked up those steps looking like someone who had never committed a crime before was, in fact, someone who had thought about this more carefully than the crime scene is designed to suggest? This concept has a name in forensic psychology. It is called calculated incompetence, and it is not theoretical. It has been documented in a small but consistent body of criminal cases involving perpetrators who were educated enough to understand the investigative process, psychologically sophisticated enough to engineer the narrative they wanted investigators to construct, and patient enough to execute a plan that looked, on the surface, like no plan at all. If calculated incompetence applies here, and the behavioral analysts who raised it were explicit that they believed it might, then the $100 outfit is not evidence of a desperate, impulsive person acting without a plan. It is evidence of a careful, calculating person acting with a plan that is designed to look like exactly the opposite of what it is. Ready here, and most importantly, ring that notification bell, because this case is moving. Updates are coming, and when they break, I need you to be the first person to know. The Nancy Guthrie case is not finished. Not by a long distance. And Cold Case 007 will be here for every single moment of it. Every update, every development, every answer that finally arrives. Do not miss it. Now, the glove. As the search for Nancy Guthrie entered its most urgent and most desperate phase, as the family was making televised public appeals and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was fielding calls from across the country, and federal resources were being quietly allocated in ways that suggested the investigation was already moving in a specific direction, investigators found something on the roadside. A single black glove, not in a dumpster, not in a trash can, not deliberately concealed or buried or disposed of in a way that suggested any real effort to hide it. Just dropped on the side of the road, less than 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, along what law enforcement has publicly identified as a logical escape route from her neighborhood. Drop the way you drop something that has already done its job. The way you discard the wrapper from something you have finished consuming. When forensic analysts pulled the glove from the scene and compared it against the gloves visible in the surveillance footage, the same black nitro gloves visible on the hands of the masked figure walking up Nancy's porch steps. The match in type, size, and visible characteristics was described by investigators as striking. And then, on the exact same day that the glove was recovered, the exact same day, cameras positioned outside the home of Tommaso San and Annie Guthrie captured something. Something that, if you know how to read it in the language of forensic investigation protocol, is not subtle at all. Federal agents arrived at the property. They moved through the house. And when they emerged, they were carrying a brown paper bag. Stop, right there, because I need to explain something to you that most people who do not have a background in forensic investigation would not automatically know, and that once you understand it, changes the meaning of that brown paper bag entirely. The container that a crime scene investigator uses to transport evidence is not an arbitrary choice. It is not whatever happens to be available in the back of the evidence van or closest to hand in the supply room. It is a deliberate, protocol-driven decision that is made based on the nature of the evidence being transported. There are rules, and those rules exist for a precise scientific reason. Hard objects, weapons, tools, electronic devices, physical items without biological material attached to them are transported in plastic bags or plastic containers. The hard seal of plastic protects them, keeps them clean, prevents contamination by environmental factors. Biological evidence, sweat, skin cells, hair, blood, saliva, any living material that carries genetic information, is transported in paper bags. Always, without exception. The reason is chemistry. Biological evidence contains moisture. Seal that moisture inside a plastic bag, and you create conditions for mold growth. And mold does not simply contaminate biological evidence. It consumes it. It digests the genetic material, the DNA, that the investigators need in order to make a match. It destroys the very information they are trying to preserve. Paper, by contrast, allows the material to breathe. Moisture can dissipate. The genetic information remains stable. The DNA stays intact for the laboratory analysis that will determine whether it matches someone in a database or someone whose DNA has been collected for comparison. The FBI showed up at Tommaso San's house carrying paper bags. This was not their first visit to that property. It was not their second or their third or their fourth or their fifth. It was their sixth. Their sixth visit to the home of Tommaso San and Annie Guthrie. And on this sixth visit, they left with biological evidence. Whatever was inside that brown paper bag, whatever the FBI collected on their sixth visit to that property and transported in the container specifically designated for living genetic material, they believed with sufficient professional certainty to use that specific container that it contained DNA, that it was worth protecting at all costs, that it needed to breathe, that it needed to survive intact all the way to the laboratory, because in that laboratory, it was going to be compared against something else. The glove was already in a forensic lab. The biological material from the house was now on its way to one. And somewhere in those two separate facilities, two separate streams of genetic evidence were working their way toward the same moment. The moment when a technician would hold up the results of both analyses and either find a match or not find one. The truth was already in motion. It had been set in motion the moment that figure stepped onto Nancy Guthrie's porch. The question was not whether it would arrive. The question was when. Now, let us talk about the body, about what the physical frame visible in that surveillance footage can tell investigators about the person inside the mask, because it turns out the answer is quite a lot. One of the foundational principles of forensic biometric analysis is this: you can change your clothes, your hair, your voice, and your face. You can practice a different walk. You can choose a disguise, but you cannot change your skeleton, your bone structure, the ratio of your torso to your legs, the width of your pelvis, the architecture of your shoulders, the geometry of how your weight is distributed when you move is fixed. It is determined at a level of biological fact that no amount of preparation or disguise can alter. And trained forensic analysts can extract that skeletal profile from video footage with a high degree of reliability, provided they have a fixed reference point to calibrate against. Nancy Guthrie's front porch provided that reference point in the form of its bricks. Standard-size bricks are one of the most reliable calibration tools in forensic biometric analysis precisely because their dimensions are known, consistent, and universally standardized. By measuring the figure in the footage against the bricks visible in the same frame, building a precise scale calculation using those fixed reference points, analysts were able to construct a physical profile of the suspect with a confidence level that the behavioral evidence alone could not provide. What they found: height between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 11 inches. Weight estimated at up to 230 pounds. Body structure significantly longer in the torso relative to the leg length. An anatomical characteristic determined by the dimensions of the spine and rib cage that no outfit conceals. Broad through the hips. Stocky and solid in build rather than lean or conventionally athletic. A body that carries its weight in the center. These measurements are not vague. They are not approximate in a way that leaves them open to wide interpretation. They describe a specific body type with specific skeletal characteristics that are present in the footage regardless of the clothing being worn over them. A baggy jacket does not make a person's torso shorter relative to their legs. A loose coat does not narrow the width of the pelvis. The skeleton shows through the disguise. It always does. And then there were the eyebrows. This is the detail that, when it became public, stopped millions of people mid-scroll. The detail that generated more discussion on more platforms than almost any other single element of this case. And it is easy to see why, because at first glance, it seems almost too small to matter. And yet the more carefully you examine what it means in the context of a forensic behavioral profile, the more significant it becomes. When forensic image specialists zoomed into the high-resolution infrared frames of the surveillance footage, specifically the frames that show the eye holes of the ski mask from close enough to resolve fine detail, what they found was that the suspect's eyebrows were visible. Not fully, not completely, but visible enough to be assessed. And what the assessment revealed was this: the eyebrows were groomed. Not wild, not the untouched, overgrown eyebrows of someone who never looks in a mirror with any particular intention. Deliberately maintained. Shaped. The kind of eyebrows that belong to someone who tends to their appearance as a matter of routine. Someone who looks in a mirror with regularity and with care. Someone who curates how they present themselves to the world. Now, in a different context, in a story about someone's morning routine or personal grooming habits, groomed eyebrows are completely unremarkable. Millions of people have groomed eyebrows. It means nothing in isolation. But in the context of a criminal behavioral profile, in the specific context of trying to understand who is behind that mask and what kind of person they are, groomed eyebrows are a data point. A specific, legible, meaningful data point. Because they tell the analyst something about the person's relationship to their social environment. Groomed eyebrows indicate a person who belongs to a social structure that they care about maintaining. They indicate someone with a reputation to uphold, an image to project, a standing in their community that matters enough to them that they invest regular attention in it. They indicate, in the language of behavioral profiling, someone who is visible in their world, someone who shows up in public spaces regularly enough that how they look in those spaces is something they think about. That profile is inconsistent with the profile of a transient, a drifter, an isolated individual operating on the margins of society. It is inconsistent with someone who lives outside social structures entirely. It points, with behavioral specificity, towards someone embedded, local, established, the kind of person you would walk past in a grocery store or a school hallway or a neighborhood gathering and register as completely, entirely, unremarkably ordinary. The physical measurements from the biometric analysis, height, weight, torso-to-leg ratio, hip width, were placed alongside available photographs of Tommaso San. Family photographs from gatherings that almost certainly took place in the house those investigators had now visited 6 times. Band photographs from the local music scene he was part of. 15 years of school photographs, staff pictures, the visual record that accumulates around a person who has lived in one place, in one community, for a long time. The forensic analyst who conducted the comparison described the overlap between the physical profile derived from the footage and the physical characteristics visible in the photographs of Tommaso San as significant. They were careful with their language, careful in the way that trained forensic professionals always are when speaking to the difference between correlation and confirmation. Not conclusive, not proof, not a match in the definitive legal sense of that word, but significant and not comfortable. Now I need to pause here and tell you about a man named Carlos Pasuelos, because his story is an essential part of the story of this investigation, and to leave it out would be to leave out one of the most important lessons this case has to teach about the distance between pattern recognition and proof. 8 hours after the FBI released the surveillance footage to the public. Not 8 days, not 8 weeks, 8 hours. Police in South Tucson pulled over a delivery driver. His name was Carlos Pasuelos. They detained him. They searched his family's home. They treated him, for a period of time, as a genuine and credible person of interest in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The basis for his detention was a single physical characteristic visible through the eye holes of the ski mask in the surveillance footage. The suspect's eyes, dark, large, almond-shaped, bore a resemblance, in the assessment of the officers and members of the public who had been flooding the tip lines since the footage was released, to the eyes of the delivery driver they had pulled over. Carlos Pasuelos was innocent. His alibi placed him nowhere near Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood at the time of her disappearance. He was eventually released. He was cleared. He was a man who went to work one day and found himself on the wrong side of a police investigation because the mathematics of public desperation had briefly landed on his face as a match for a pair of eyes in a blurry surveillance frame. An innocent man detained, searched, cleared. This story does not exist to criticize the officers who responded to the tip or the system that processed it. It exists because it is a reminder, a blunt, concrete, real-world reminder of what can happen when the public is armed with surveillance footage and the urgency that comes with a missing elderly woman and the very human tendency to trust pattern recognition more than the evidence itself supports. Pattern recognition is one of the most powerful cognitive tools human beings possess. It is part of how we navigate the world. It is part of how investigations get broken. But it is also a tool that can cause real harm to real innocent people when it outpaces the forensic evidence. When the eye says this matches before the science has had the chance to confirm or deny it. Carlos Pasuelos is not a footnote. He is a person, and he deserves to be remembered as one. Now, ownership behavior. I want to come back to this concept because it runs through this case like a thread, pulling tighter and tighter the more evidence you layer on top of it. In the accumulated body of criminal profiling literature developed over the past 20 years, Ownership behavior refers to a specific cluster of physical and psychological markers that investigators observe when someone moves through a space in which they feel, at a preconscious level, a sense of ownership or belonging. It is not about whether the person legally owns or occupies the space. It is about whether their nervous system has categorized it as familiar territory. As their territory, in every element of the behavioral analysis of the figure on Nancy Guthrie's porch points toward ownership behavior with a consistency that the analysts who reviewed the footage found difficult to set aside. He did not press himself against the wall as he approached. He did not crouch. He did not move in the way that a person moves when they're trying to minimize their visual profile, to reduce the amount of space they're taking up in a place that does not belong to them. He did not check the street behind him at the base of the steps. He did not scan the neighboring windows in a way that every trained model of covert behavior in an unfamiliar residential environment would predict. He walked up those steps the way you walk up the steps to your own front door, like a man with a right to be there, like a man whose body had already decided that the question of whether he belonged in this space was not a question that required any consideration at all. Susan Constantine, a behavioral analyst and body language expert who reviewed the footage, was direct and specific in her assessment. This is not how strangers move through unfamiliar environments. In high-stakes, unfamiliar environments, the human nervous system generates observable, documentable physiological responses. Elevated scanning behavior, shortened stride, physical tension in the shoulders and jaw, micro-movements in the extremities that reflect elevated adrenaline. None of those markers are present in this footage. The body is quiet. The movement is smooth. The figure moves through the space with the physiological signature of a person for whom nothing about it is new. And then there is the branch. After tapping the camera with 2 fingers, after covering the lens with his hand for a moment, the figure reaches up and places a branch, a piece of foliage, over the camera. Slowly, without rushing, without any of the urgency that you would expect from someone engaged in the active commission of a violent crime in a location where they could be seen at any moment. He places it the way you place a picture frame back on a wall you have walked past every day. Calm, deliberate, unafraid, not smashing the camera, not spraying it with paint, not destroying it in the way that a person unfamiliar with how cloud-based backup systems work might assume would be necessary to eliminate the footage. Covering it, gently, like someone who wants things to look undisturbed, like someone who knows this house well enough to care about how it looks when they are done. That combination, the approach without scanning, the direct path to the camera, the ownership tap, the unhurried placement of the branch, builds a behavioral picture that points, with accumulating consistency, in a single direction. This person has been here before. Not once, not twice. Enough times for the porch, the steps, the camera position, the surrounding space to be stored not in their conscious memory, but in their body's automatic knowledge of the world. Now, the 4 hours. Tommaso Sand drove Nancy Guthrie home at 9:50 in the evening. He walked her through the door. He said goodnight. He left. 3 hours and 57 minutes later, the camera on her porch went dark. His home is less than 4 miles from Nancy Guthrie's house. In Tucson, Arizona, at 2 in the morning, when the streets are quiet and the traffic is minimal, 4 miles translates to a drive of approximately 10 minutes. For hours, 10-minute commute. Think about what that means. Think about what the construction of that window looks like to an investigator building a timeline. 4 hours is not a gap. 4 hours is not a period of time so short that it rules out the possibility of additional activity between 9:50 and 1:47. 4 hours is a logistical runway. It is enough time to return home, make decisions, make preparations, return to a neighborhood you already know, and arrive at a porch that your body already knows how to find in the dark. That window has no confirmed public alibi attached to it, not one that has been established and verified by independent evidence. And in the calculus of a criminal investigation, an unaccounted 4-hour window in the timeline of someone with a physical profile that matches the surveillance footage and a behavioral history that places them at the crime scene location earlier the same evening is not a minor detail. It is one of the architectural elements on which this entire investigation rests. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words "I'm still here." Let me see who is truly following this case. Because what we are about to get into, the Bitcoin wallet, the ransom demand, the blockchain forensics, the erotomanic profile, and the two roads that this investigation is walking simultaneously, is where this story goes from disturbing to genuinely extraordinary. And I need to know you are with me. Now, the ransom. In the days following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, a ransom demand entered the public record. The figure named was $6 million. The currency specified was Bitcoin, and the wallet address, the digital destination to which those $6 million were supposedly to be sent, was transmitted not to Nancy's family through private channels, not through a lawyer, not through a secure intermediary, not through any of the mechanisms that an organized criminal operation might use to establish contact and negotiate payment discreetly. It was sent to media outlets, $6 million in Bitcoin, transmitted via a wallet address that went directly to newsrooms rather than to the people supposedly being held responsible for paying it. $6 million sounds, on its face, like an organized criminal enterprise. It sounds like infrastructure and experience and people who understand how to move large sums of cryptocurrency through the digital financial system without leaving a recoverable trail. It sounds like a demand from people who know what they are doing. Except that when investigators, and specifically when federal blockchain analysts whose entire professional mandate is to follow cryptocurrency transactions through the public ledger that records every single Bitcoin movement in real time, examine the wallet address that had been publicly circulated with that demand, what they found was not $6 million. What they found was a single transaction, one of under $300. Under $300. Not a fraction of $6 million, not a partial payment, not evidence that the full sum was in transit through multiple wallets being laundered toward its final destination. Under $300. One transaction, a sum so small relative to the stated demand that it could not be interpreted as a ransom payment by any meaningful definition of the term. What it almost certainly is, and what the FBI's behavior in the days immediately following its discovery strongly implies, is a law enforcement operation. Specifically, a technique that federal investigators use when monitoring cryptocurrency addresses linked to criminal activity. It is called tickling the wire. The mechanics of tickling the wire are straightforward. Law enforcement identifies a cryptocurrency wallet address linked to a criminal demand or activity. They deposit a small amount of cryptocurrency into that wallet, small enough to be unremarkable, large enough to register as a balance worth checking. And then they watch. They monitor the activity on that wallet address around the clock, using blockchain surveillance tools that could detect any interaction with the address in real time. Because the moment someone accesses that wallet, the moment the person who controls it opens the application or platform they use to manage their cryptocurrency and checks whether any funds have arrived, their device makes a connection to the network. That connection carries information. Specifically, it carries an IP address, the numerical identifier assigned to the specific device and network being used to access the wallet. That IP address carries a geographic location. And that geographic location, depending on how careful the person accessing the wallet has been about masking their digital footprint, can carry something even more specific than a city or a neighborhood. It can carry a name. The FBI is not sitting in a room somewhere waiting for $6 million to arrive in a Bitcoin wallet. They already know that is not going to happen. What they are waiting for is one login. One moment when the person who controls that wallet becomes impatient or anxious or simply curious about whether anyone has responded to their demand and opens the application to check the balance. One login. That is all they need. And at the time of this telling, the wallet had been completely silent. Not one access. Not one login. Not one moment when the person on the other end of that demand reached out to confirm whether their message had been received. Now think carefully about what that silence tells us, because it tells us something very specific, and the conclusions it supports are important. If the person who sent that ransom demand is a professional criminal, if they have genuine experience in cryptocurrency operations and a real understanding of how blockchain surveillance works, then the silence is not suspicious. It is strategic. Professionals in the digital criminal underground do not leave funds sitting in a monitored wallet. The moment a wallet address is released publicly as part of a ransom demand, it becomes a surveillance target. It becomes something to be avoided. A professional would know this. A professional would have no need to check the balance, because a professional would have already anticipated that any funds deposited into that address would be a trap. So professional silence is possible. But consider the alternative. If the person who sent that demand is not a professional, if they assembled their knowledge of Bitcoin from general public information about cryptocurrency privacy, without the deeper operational understanding of blockchain forensics and law enforcement surveillance tools, then their silence is not strategy. It is paralysis. It is the frozen inaction of someone who set up a wallet, sent an address to media outlets, and then discovered, or began to suspect, that something had gone wrong, that the demand had not generated the response they expected, that the silence from the other side was not the compliance of a frightened family, but the strategic quiet of an investigation that was already watching every breath they took in the digital space. Investigators have described the profile suggested by the totality of the digital evidence, in this case, as occupying what they call the middle ground of competency. Enough technical knowledge to be dangerous, not enough operational experience to be safe. The suspect knew enough about cloud-based security systems to understand that the camera needed to be disabled, but not enough to know that the footage had already been uploaded before the camera went dark. They knew enough about Bitcoin to understand that cryptocurrency offers a degree of anonymity not available through conventional banking, but not enough to understand that checking a wallet balance is as traceable as cashing out. They knew enough about the investigative process to want to construct a crime scene that looked messy and impulsive and low budget, but possibly not enough to know whether that construction was working. That narrow band of informed but not expert technological capability, that specific range of knowledge that lies between general public understanding and genuine criminal operational expertise, fits a profile. And the profile it fits is not that of a career criminal. It is not the profile of someone who has moved through the criminal justice system multiple times and learned from direct experience how investigators work. It is the profile of an educated person, someone who understands how systems work in principle, from books, from media coverage, from general intellectual engagement with technology in the world, but who lacks the specific, operational, experiential knowledge that comes from actually having done this before. An educated person, a curious person, a person who understands a theory but not the practice, a person who, in another context, might be described as someone who does their research. That profile is consistent with a science teacher, someone who has spent 15 years explaining how systems work to teenagers in a classroom, someone who thinks carefully and analytically about cause and effect, about the mechanics of how things operate, about the relationship between actions and their consequences, someone who is comfortable with technical information and capable of independent research. That profile is consistent with a great many other people as well. And I want to be absolutely clear about something before we go any further. None of what I'm telling you is a verdict. None of it is a charge. None of it is a finding of guilt. Tommaso San has not been arrested. He has not been charged with any crime. The Pima County Sheriff's Office has not publicly named him as a suspect. He has not been formally identified by any law enforcement agency as the person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. What exists is a convergence of circumstantial evidence, behavioral, physical, geographic, digital, that investigators keep returning to, a pattern that accumulates as you add each element to the pile. the physical profile that overlaps with the surveillance footage, the behavioral profile that describes the porch interaction as the movement of someone with intimate familiarity with the space, the 4-hour unaccounted window in the timeline, the fact that Tommaso San was the last person to be with Nancy Guthrie before she disappeared, the fact that the FBI has visited his home 6 times, the fact that they have left that home carrying a brown paper bag of biological evidence, the fact that the physical characteristics visible in the surveillance footage overlap with the physical characteristics visible in photographs of this specific man. Stacked individually, each of those elements has an innocent explanation. Stacked together, layered precisely, one on top of the other, building a structure whose consistency is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. They form a pattern that the investigators who are working this case every day have found impossible to walk away from. But a pattern is not proof. And proof is what the criminal justice system requires before it can do what the people who love Nancy Guthrie needed to do. And now I need to take you down the other road. The road that runs parallel to the one we have been walking. The road that starts at a completely different place and arrives at a completely different kind of threat. Because intellectual honesty in a case this complex demands that we hold both possibilities simultaneously, even when one of them is considerably harder to follow, and even when following it leads somewhere genuinely frightening. There is a psychiatric condition documented in the clinical literature and in the criminal profiling literature that may be relevant to this case. It is called erotomania, and it is, in the language of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, classified as a specific subtype of delusional disorder. Specifically, a condition in which a person develops the fixed, unshakable conviction that another person, typically someone of higher social status, someone they do not know personally, someone they have encountered primarily or entirely through media, is in love with them. The key word in that definition is fixed. The erotomania delusion is not a suspicion. It is not a hope. It is not a wish dressed up as a belief. It is a certainty, total, impenetrable, resistant to all contradiction from the external world. A person experiencing an erotomania delusion does not process evidence that contradicts the delusion as information. They process it as noise, as a temporary obstruction, as something that is not yet caught up to the truth that they already know. The object of the delusion is almost always someone unreachable, someone elevated, someone whose public visibility creates the illusion of intimacy, the sense that this person is known, that their inner life is accessible, that they're in some way present in the daily existence of the person experiencing the delusion, while simultaneously making them physically, practically inaccessible in the real world. A celebrity, a media figure, a politician, someone who appears on screens and speaks in public and occupies the emotional landscape of millions of people without ever actually meeting most of them. Apply that framework to this case, and consider who, in the constellation of people connected in Nancy Guthrie, fits the profile of an erotomania target almost exactly. Savannah Guthrie appears on millions of television screens every morning. She is one of the most visible and familiar faces in American broadcasting. She speaks directly to camera. She laughs. She emotes. She shares moments of her life, professional and occasionally personal, with an audience that has been watching her for years. She is present in the daily routines of enormous numbers of people in a way that creates, for some of those people, a feeling of relationship that has no equivalent on her side. And she is completely, institutionally, practically inaccessible to a member of the public. She is surrounded by professional security structures, by networks of lawyers and assistants and security protocols, by the architecture of institutional protection that any major television personality in a network morning show environment is surrounded by as a matter of course. For someone experiencing an erotomania delusion oriented towards Savannah Guthrie, she is the fortress, visible, present, real, and utterly, completely beyond reach. But her mother is not behind institutional walls. Her mother is an 84-year-old woman living independently in a modest house on a residential street in Tucson, Arizona. Her mother has no security detail, no kidnapping infrastructure, no professional protective layer between her front porch and the public street. Her mother is accessible. Forensic psychologists who study this specific type of behavioral dynamic have a term for what someone like Nancy Guthrie represents in the delusional architecture of an erotomanic stalker with an obsession fixated on an unreachable public figure. They call it proxy target, the accessible stand-in for the genuinely unreachable object of the obsession. The person through whom the delusional subject believes they can reach, communicate with, or make themselves known to the person they are actually focused on. Through this framework, the entire crime looks different. The ownership behavior on the porch is not evidence of physical familiarity with the space from previous visits. It is evidence of a delusional familiarity, the behavioral expression of a person who has, in the reality constructed by their own disordered mind, already been there 1,000 times, already belongs there, is already, in some sense, family. In an erotomanic framework, this person walking up those steps is not a stranger committing a crime. He is, in the geography of his own delusion, a person coming home to a family that simply has not acknowledged him yet. And here is where the groomed eyebrows become particularly significant when viewed through this lens. Why would a person planning a violent covert operation in the middle of the night take any care at all about how their eyebrows look? Why would personal grooming be part of the calculus for someone about to commit a felony in the dark wearing a mask over their face? Through the lens of a rational criminal operating a purely functional kidnapping scheme, it would not be. There would be no reason. You are wearing a mask. No one can see your face. The eyebrows are irrelevant. The only person who could possibly observe them would be whoever reviews the surveillance footage later, investigators working a case. But through the lens of erotomania, through the interior logic of a delusional reality in which this is not a crime, but a declaration, a statement, a debut, an arrival, the eyebrows make a terrible kind of sense. He knows that Savannah Guthrie will see this footage. He knows it will be broadcast nationally. He knows that the face behind the mask, or the edges of it visible around the edges of the mask, will be examined by the woman he believes already knows him, already loves him, already understands that everything he is doing is for her. He is not preparing for kidnapping. He is dressing for an audience. And then there is the ransom demand. $6 million sent to media outlets rather than to the family through private channels. $6 million that was never going to be paid because it was never really about $6 million. Through the lens of an organized criminal operation, sending a ransom demand to a television network instead of to the target family directly is a mistake. It is a strategic error. It reduces the likelihood of payment and increases the likelihood of law enforcement involvement. No professional does this. But through the lens of erotomania, it is not a mistake. It is the point. The demand sent to media outlets is not a financial transaction. It is a communication. It is a message sent directly to the screens, the platforms, the public infrastructure through which the only communication this person has ever had with the object of their delusion flows. It is a message that says, I exist. I did this. I am here. Say my name. Look at me. He does not want $6 million. He wants acknowledgement. If this theory is correct, and I want to be very precise here, because this is a theory supported by behavioral analysis and forensic psychology, not by physical evidence or confirmed facts about any specific individual, then we are not looking for someone driven by financial need or by personal grievance or by the kind of rational, identifiable motive that investigators can follow from point A to point B. We are looking for someone whose logic exists entirely inside a structure that has no correspondence to the external world. A person for whom the relationship between their actions and their goals makes complete sense in the architecture of their delusion and makes no sense at all from the outside. And that is what makes an erotomanic offender. If that is what this person is genuinely, uniquely, in a category-specific way dangerous. You cannot negotiate with a delusion. You cannot predict where it goes. You cannot apply the normal calculus of criminal motive and expect it to tell you anything useful. You are dealing with a person whose internal reality has replaced external reality entirely and who acts from that internal reality with total conviction. If this theory is correct, Nancy Guthrie was not targeted because of who she is. She was targeted because of who her daughter is. She was targeted not as the object of harm, but as the means to reach something the person responsible believes they already have a right to. She was, in the worst possible sense of the word, a vehicle, a message delivery system, a proxy for a communication that no rational person could interpret as communication at all. Both of these roads are real. Both of them deserve the honest, careful, rigorous examination that this investigation demands. One points toward a specific named individual with a specific set of verifiable connections to the crime scene and the victim. The other points toward a ghost, someone whose identity we do not yet know, whose profile exists primarily in the behavioral and psychological dimensions of the evidence, whose physical connection to the crime may be harder to trace precisely because their connection to the victim is constructed entirely out of delusion rather than relationship. I've spent a great deal of time in this story walking the first road. Let me be direct about why. The behavioral evidence from the surveillance footage, the ownership tap, the absence of scanning behavior, the direct approach to the camera, the unhurried movement through the space is strong. The physical profile overlap is documented and significant. The timeline is clean. The geography fits. The pattern of FBI activity at the property, 6 visits, the paper bag, the biological evidence, suggests that investigators have not walked away from that first road either. But the first road is not proven, and the second road is not ruled out. And Nancy Guthrie is still missing, and the investigation is still active. And somewhere, in a federal forensics laboratory, a glove and a brown paper bag full of biological material are waiting for the same answer that the rest of us are waiting for. Let me tell you what I believe this case stands for. Beyond the facts, beyond the forensic details and the behavioral analysis and the cryptocurrency forensics, beyond the cameras and the paper bags and the eyebrows and the Bitcoin wallet that will not move. I believe this case stands for a question that is uncomfortable to ask, but essential to sit with. The question of what we think we know about the people closest to us, about what the visible surface of a person's life. 15 years in a classroom, a bass guitar, family dinners, good night kisses at the door, can and cannot tell us about what lives beneath it. The people who are most capable of causing harm in the lives of those who trust them are not the strangers. The data on violent crime is consistent and clear across decades and jurisdictions and demographic categories. The person most likely to hurt you is the person who already has access to you, who already knows where you live, who already knows your routines, your security systems, your vulnerabilities, the specific hour of the night when the neighborhood goes fully quiet. The person most likely to hurt you is the person whose hand you have already shaken and whose voice you already know and whose face you have already let through your door. That is not cynicism. It is criminology. And it is one of the reasons that cases like this one, cases where the behavioral evidence points uncomfortably close to someone embedded in the victim's own life, generate the particular, specific kind of horror that they do. Not because violence is shocking, but because the specific violation of trust involved in this particular form of violence reaches into something deeply human, into the thing we all depend on every time we sit down to dinner with the people we love, the assumption that they are who we believe them to be. Nancy Guthrie sat at a table playing cards with her family on the night she disappeared. And somewhere in the hours that followed, something happened that is still waiting, as of this telling, to be fully understood and fully answered. She has not been found. The glove is still in the laboratory. The technicians working it are not dealing in theories or behavioral profiles or ownership taps. They are working in the language of nucleotides and base pairs and genetic sequences that either match or do not match the reference material the FBI collected on 6 visits to a house less than 4 miles from Nancy Guthrie's front porch. The DNA does not negotiate. It does not compromise. It does not allow for a behavioral counterargument or a competing interpretation. It will either say yes or it will say no. And when it says either of those things, every conversation we have been having about patterns and circumstantial evidence and behavioral fingerprints will either collapse or confirm in a single moment. The paper bag, that brown paper bag, chosen because it breathes, chosen because it preserves the moisture in biological material rather than trapping and destroying it, is moving through the chain of federal forensic analysis that will ultimately tell investigators what genetic information it contains and whether that information places a specific known individual at the crime scene or inside the victim's home at a time they could not have been there through any innocent means. The Bitcoin wallet is still being watched. Every interaction with that address, every login, every balance check, every moment when the person holding the private key for that wallet allows their device to make contact with the network will be captured, logged, traced. The FBI does not run out of patience with a monitored wallet. They do not look away. They do not stop watching. They are waiting for one moment of human impatience or human anxiety or simple human need to know whether the message was received. One moment is all they need. The truth is in motion. It has been in motion since 1:47 in the morning on the night that Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Every piece of evidence that has been collected since then is a thread attached to that moment. And the investigators pulling on those threads are not going to stop pulling. The question that this story ends on is not a theoretical one. It is not a forensic puzzle or a behavioral exercise or an exercise in documentary construction. It is a question about a real woman who is 84 years old and who has not been found. A real woman with a daughter who goes to work every morning and faces a camera and keeps doing her job while carrying something that most people could not carry and keeps standing upright. A real woman with grandchildren, with a neighborhood, with a life that was interrupted on what was supposed to be just another Tuesday night. She is not a theory. She's not a case number. She is not the unnamed victim in a true crime narrative that exists to explore the psychology of the person who harmed her. She is Nancy Guthrie, and she's still out there, and the people who love her are still waiting. If you know anything at all, about what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night of her disappearance, please do not carry it quietly. The moment to come forward is not later. It is not when you feel ready. It is right now. The Pima County Sheriff's Office is the primary contact point for tips and information related to this investigation. If you have seen something, heard something, know something, even something small, even something that might seem insignificant to you in isolation, please make the call. You have no way of knowing which piece is the one that completes the picture. The investigators do, and they are waiting. The mask is still on. The science does not sleep. And here at Cold Case 007, neither do we. Before I let you go, because this story is not finished, not by a long distance, and I need you to be here when it continues, I need you to do 3 things right now. Hit the like button on this video. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case, your theory, your questions, the detail that you cannot stop thinking about. And subscribe to Cold Case 007 and hit the notification bell so that when the next update breaks, and it will break because the DNA is in the lab and the wallet is being watched and the FBI does not stop, you will be the first person to know. We do not cover these cases for the numbers. We cover them because Nancy Guthrie deserves to be found, and because the questions that surround her disappearance are not going away, and because someone has to keep asking them. That is what we do here. That is what we will keep doing until this case breaks and the truth finally comes all the way to the surface. The mask is still on, but it will not stay on forever. We will see you in the next update.